That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G is specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441. Hello and welcome to That's Debatable, the weekly news podcast of the Free Speech Union. Welcome back to all of our listeners. It's another week in the free speech world, and we are excited again to have Freddie with us for today's episode. He was with us last week, and he's here this week. Ben will be back, we hope, in a week or so. Freddie, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks, Tom. Yeah, how are you?
I'm doing all right. What we're going to do today is we're going to try and look at some of the free speech implications of the manifestos, and it got me scurrying back to Yes, Prime Minister. There's the famous episode in Yes, Minister. It's the bridging episode. It's a Christmas special called Party Games, and I suspect that might be the title of today's episode, where Jim Hacker becomes Prime Minister. And there's a free speech moment in that episode, which I had forgotten, where Sir Humphrey, there's a quote from him. Sir Humphrey says, "How are things at the campaign for the freedom of information, by the way?" And Sir Arnold says, "Sorry, I cannot talk about that." And, you know, that was 1984, 40 years ago. And here we are still talking about pretty similar things, I think it's fair to say. But Freddie, I mean, you've done lots and lots of hard work on the manifestos, and you've written up articles which have been in our weekly newsletters and on each of the main party manifestos. So I think without further ado, we could probably launch in to what we think about them. Just as a reminder to people, we have at the Free Speech Union, we have 5 freedoms that we defend: freedom of speech, academic freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. And so what we have done is go through and do a compare and contrast of the main manifestos. All of this on a non-partisan basis. We don't support any particular political party. We're just analysing all of this from a free speech perspective. And the first thing I thought, Freddie, it's fair to say that there are positive things in every manifesto. Is that a reasonable place to start? A nice optimistic place to start?
Yes, I think so. There are, I mean, so certainly the Labour Party manifesto keeps their, they keep their cards pretty close to their chest about what they're planning to do. But even despite that, there are a few positives there as well, where they get into the specifics a little bit more. So yeah, I'd say good and bad for all of them. Yeah.
I mean, sticking on that, and we've got a crib sheet in front of us, so we can do a good compare and contrast. I mean, the positive that came. Let's jump to the current government. One of the positives that came from that one was protecting teachers from blasphemy accusations. So in the manifesto, the Conservative manifesto says, "We will ban protests outside schools to stop mobs from intimidating teachers and children. We will always uphold and promote fundamental British values and ensure they are protected from accusations of blasphemy." Now, there's a good and a bad in there, isn't there, Freddie?
Yeah.
I think we certainly support upholding British values and ensuring that people are able to, in inverted commas, blaspheme in Britain. But we feel less comfortable about the way in which that promise might actually be fulfilled in practice.
Yes, and I think it's been a debating point, hasn't it, Tom, within the organisation about public space protection orders. I mean, so this is as I understand it, the idea for this came from a report by Lord Walney, who was the government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption. And one of the points
Yeah.
he made in his report was that the protesters are intimidating schools and teachers when children are taught things that they disagree with. So one of the proposals that he came up with was for what's known as expedited public space protection orders, EPSPOs, which would be placed in the vicinity of schools, so protests couldn't happen there. Now, I think there are potential problems there from a free speech angle. If we just take away the content of what's happening there for a moment, the idea that there are going to be so many spaces. I mean, you could probably work out how many acres of land around schools this would be, where certain forms of speech are not, which are technically lawful speech, not allowed. So I think there's an argument for teaching and schools are special places where this shouldn't happen, but there is also this other argument about curtailment of free speech in public space as well.
And we've had a couple of segments on this podcast, Freddie, I think, where we've talked about PSPOs generally, not these expedited PSPOs, but just general PSPOs, where this whole concern around mission creep is what we are concerned about. So things like wolf whistling effectively being banned in certain areas. Also, the geographical extent of PSPOs creeping so that it would encompass the whole of a district, which is not actually what that's in the law. The original sort of antisocial behavior law, that was not the intention. They were meant to be kind of specific zones within a borough or within a district. So we've talked about concerns, and I think that's where we would definitely want to raise, shall we say, a red flag, not wanting to make this sound too much like a dating site, but we would raise a red flag, with PSPOs on steroids or EPSPOs. But anyway, there's some positive in there. There's some positive in there from the Conservative. I mean, another positive on the Labour side was extending parliamentary privilege. So, Freddie, what was that all about?
Yeah, that was an unexpected one, and I think the origins of it probably the origins of it are, I think the Labour government feel, or a potential Labour government would feel a duty to make devolution work and devolution a success, given that it was essentially one of Tony Blair's. It was a legacy of the Blair governments, but I think it dates back. Particularly for Sir Keir Starmer, it dates back quite a few years. And he has actually made noises about this before, about the fact that, we need the devolved assemblies to allow for robust questioning of parliamentarians, and we need robust questioning of things that are happening in society, and parliaments should be the place to do that. The context is that the devolved assemblies don't have the same parliamentary privilege that the English Parliament does. So, whereas parliamentary privilege guarantees freedom of speech for MPs and Lords alike, and it allows them to make statements in either chamber of the House, knowing that they've got legal protection, and particularly it gives legal protection if others repeat their statements once they've been made in Parliament. But in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, that isn't the case. There's a practical example of this, and it dates back to 2021 when the Tory MP David Davis took to the floor in the House of Commons to talk about a lack of parliamentary privilege at Holyrood. And his point was this had created a deficit of power and a deficit of accountability in Holyrood, in the Scottish Devolved Assembly. And what he actually did was he read out a series, or at least one or two text messages that a whistleblower had handed to him about a Scottish government inquiry into the handling of misconduct complaints against the then former First Minister Alex Salmond. And I think that the point he was making was that, in fact, this is a direct quote, he said, if an MSP in Holyrood were to do the same as I've just done, they would likely find themselves facing down prosecution, and that would have been either from the Crown Office or the Procurator Fiscal Service. So we had this really important case of potential corruption, potential political corruption, and yet parliamentarians in Scotland at Holyrood weren't able to talk about these things. David Davis was. So he made this point very strongly and very persuasively. And it was actually, I think that was the first time when Sir Keir Starmer was asked about this. and he was, wholeheartedly in agreement with it. And so it's obviously very important that parliamentarians can get up, as they can in Westminster, and make points, raise issues or concerns without fear of legal consequences. So that was Sir Keir Starmer who at that point came out in favour of this particular pledge, if you like. It stands out with the Labour manifesto. It's a specific pledge, and it's in there amongst a lot of sort of generalities. There's this one very, very positive, very specific pledge in there, and I think we definitely approve of that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially as the various parliaments, various devolved parliaments have themselves evolved. So they were devolved, but they've evolved, and they have become a much, much more important part of the national conversation, I think it's fair to say, over the last 25 years plus since Tony Blair brought them in. So that definitely makes a lot of sense. And another positive, so moving to the Lib Dems, the piece of legislation or the proposal that they have in their manifesto that we think is pretty positive is that they are intending to pass a comprehensive anti-SLAPP law to provide robust protection for free speech, whistleblowers, and media scrutiny against, and SLAPP stands for strategic lawsuits against public participation. And I think it's fair to say we have had members of the Free Speech Union write into our help email in a situation where they've been slapped with a slap. And it is a very frightening thing to happen. It's happened in the examples we have. We've had examples where people have made online reviews, for example, have particularly come under the spotlight here. You write an online review, you've had a service, and surprise, surprise, because it was a poor review, and really it is surprise, surprise. You're not expecting this. You suddenly get a letter through the post that's very threatening, very worrying, and asking for some money to settle out of court, and otherwise you have to sort of lawyer up. So it really does have a chilling effect.
Yes, I think the Conservative government had almost, if you like, got half of the way there. There was an amendment that, I think it did get through before the end of the Parliament, to an act that would have it would have focused on economic cases where strategic lawsuits against public participation focused on there were economic issues involved, or it was a story to do with finance and so on. But a lot of commentators in the press and journalists have pointed out that there are a lot of other forms of SLAPP that happen. It's not just about sort of economic corruption claims and so on. So I guess, Tom, the only issue with this is whether and at what point where you're going to determine that a case is a SLAPP and when it's not a SLAPP. And I may be thinking, judges and lawyers might sort of suggest that actually, they need to hear a case before they can determine whether it's a form of SLAPP or not. So the problem with this legislation is at what point do you knock it out? At what point do you say, no, this is a SLAPP, you can't go ahead with this form of litigation? And at what point do you actually have to say, well, we need to hear the details of the case. People need to be able to do this before we can, determine what type of case, whether it's a valid or whether it's an illegitimate form of legal action. So that's an issue, I guess, with this form of legislation.
Access to the courts is important, and you're right. So, in some way, constraining or stopping people from going to the courts has to be done very tentatively, very cautiously, because they're such a pillar of freedom, or they ought to be, in defending our freedom. So when the courts are abused, it does create that conundrum. It does create a potential paradox. And then lastly, we should mention reform, which I think is the fourth analysis you've done, Freddie. The one I'm going to pick on that we would be quite positive about is they are going to review the online safety. They call it the Online Safety Bill, but it is actually now the Online Safety Act. It was passed in the last Parliament. And in their contract, I think they call it, at Reform, they've said that social media giants that push baseless transgender ideology and divisive critical race theory should have no role in regulating free speech. And I think we would wholeheartedly applaud that. and say, we were very, very worried about the online safety bill coming in and its effect on freedom of expression. At no point were we saying that children, for example, in particular, should not be protected from some of the vile things that happen online. But we did rather feel this was the wrong way of going about it. This effectively would end up outlawing awful but lawful speech,
Yeah.
and comes back to that never-ending question as to who decides where the line is between what's appropriate online and what's not. So I think it's fair to
Yeah.
say we were pretty positive about that, weren't we, Freddie?
Yeah, we were, and the bill that reached the statute books is certainly a lot better in terms of its protections for free speech and online free speech and freedom of expression than the first few iterations, which were crazy. Which, as you said, had this provision, Section 13, I think it was, about lawful but harmful content, and then there were all the arguments about, well, that is that going to go far beyond what the law dictates should be removed, and so on and so forth. So that in the end was scrapped, and the minister who was responsible towards the end, Michelle Donnellan, pushed the idea of user empowerment. So rather than service providers sort of being censorious and chopping stuff out and cutting stuff out for the good, paternalist good of our users, she pushed the idea that we should empower users themselves to make choices. Okay, if you don't want to see something, that's fine. So click a button to default off that type of content. But it's the individual who makes that choice. That at least was the provision that Michelle Donnellan pushed, and that reached the statute books with that idea inscribed within the legislation. Why I think we would approve of and want to see a parliamentary review, a select committee review of what's happening with the legislation is how, one of the issues is how that user empowerment model is going to be embedded within actual social media platforms. So one of the sort of troubling aspects of this, it sounds good, user empowerment and so on, but of course, if social media companies default on an option which is safe mode, so default on, you don't want to see this type of content, you don't want to see misinformation, fake news, all of the type of stuff which is potentially distasteful to some people. If that's defaulted off in the new social media architecture under the Online Safety Act, then how many people are actually going to switch it back on again? How many people are going to know that there's that default option that they can switch? So are we actually, a review would be good to see what type of architecture social media platforms are planning to build in to their user facing platforms, because we could end up with this situation in which we get legal but harmful, that provision, by stealth, because they're going to simply switch the stuff off by default at the very, when you switch onto your platform one morning, they're going to have defaulted a lot of content off, and they won't tell you necessarily. So that's a risk as this act goes forward and Ofcom decide what they want to do with it. So I think it would be right and proper that we had a review of what was happening with that.
Yeah. So those are the positives. Those are the sorts of, or some of the positives anyway. We did want to mention something positive about each of the sort of major manifestos that we reviewed. I thought it would be quite interesting next to jump to press freedom of the press, because it's something we don't touch on that much actually in the podcast. We talk about it relatively regularly, but it's not one of the sort of most frequent occurring topics to talk about. And Leveson has popped up a couple of times. I don't think it's mentioned in the Labour manifesto, but it is mentioned in the Lib Dem manifesto, and it is mentioned in the Conservative manifesto. So in what's interesting is they're completely opposing positions on Leveson Part 2. In the Lib Dem manifesto, I think what you wrote in your review of that, Freddie, is that what they say, what the Lib Dems say, is shorthand for forcing all newspapers and magazines to submit themselves to regulation by Impress, the state-approved press regulator. So they will push through Leveson Part 2. By contrast, in the Conservative manifesto, the comment there is, we oppose state regulation and control of the press, including any attempt to bring forward Leveson 2 or reopen the Royal Charter on self-regulation of the press. And what's interesting, again, looking at your analysis of the Conservative manifesto, is that Section 40 of the Crime and Courts Act, that was introduced in the wake of the original Leveson inquiry, that was repealed by the outgoing government in the concluding days of the last Parliament. And you mentioned the News Media Association. They had previously welcomed a proposed repeal of Section 40 because it would force news publishers, to pay the costs of any court judgment if they were not a member of the state-approved regulator. So, Freddie,
regardless of the court judgment, Tom,
right,
that's the crazy
that's
thing.
the key point.
It forced news publishers to pay the cost of any court judgment if they were not a member of the state-approved regulator, regardless of the court judgment, whether they won or lost. I mean, that is crazy.
Yeah. So win or lose, you're on the hook if you're not part of this impress. And what's interesting there, completely different takes on that. So there is a place where you've got two very, very different ones. And obviously we would, as defenders of freedom of the press, we would not want to see Leveson 2 brought forward or pushed any further. So, there's a clear view there. There's clear distance between the two parties.
Yeah.
Should we bite the bullet and go into conversion therapy, Freddie?
Yeah, let's do it.
It's an ongoing issue. I've lost count of the number of times we've gone to our members and asked them to support us, writing into MPs as this sort of saga has rolled on. And I would say that across the Conservative, the Labour, and the Lib Dem manifestos, I would say there are three different approaches to conversion therapy, ranging from a very clear, complete ban on conversion therapy with no qualification at the Lib Dem end, through in the Labour manifesto to a ban but with some qualification in the manifesto, through to a lot more qualification, and we need to be a lot more cautious perhaps with the Conservative manifesto. Would that be a fair representation, Freddie?
Yes, and I think the Conservative Party manifesto continues their for a number of years now. I think they've wanted to do something about it, but every time they get close to doing something about it, they actually realise that in terms of legislation, this is a very complex issue with inevitably unintended consequences for freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and there's been various iterations of private members' bills brought by members of parliament from all parties, and various attempts at draft legislation that just simply don't really they can't get into a position where they are able to almost respect Article 910 ECHR rights to freedom of expression and so on. So it's a difficult one.
Well, I think, is there any mention, Freddie, you may not be able to recall this, whether there's any mention in the manifestos themselves of the Cass Review final report? Because I think in the Labour version of this, so the wording in the Labour manifesto is as follows: Labour will finally deliver a full trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices while protecting the freedom of speech for people to explore their sexuality and gender identity. And when I read that second part, that reference to freedom of speech, I wondered whether that might be a nod to the Cass Review in terms of that point that was made by Dr. Hilary Cass, that this debate has been toxic, and that there's been no recognition of two sides of the debate, and there has been a shutting down of free expression around the debate on conversion therapy. And so when the Labour manifesto says, while protecting the freedom of speech for people to explore their sexuality and gender identity, I wondered whether that might be a nod to the Cass Review from Labour.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't really. I mean, that section of the Labour Party manifesto is so long. There's so many
Yeah.
caveats and clauses that you sort of lose the sense of it. But no, that could be possible. Actually, I hadn't considered that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's interesting as well in the Conservative manifesto around this issue. To going back to your point about the Conservatives, I guess having been in power, recognise how complex this issue is. They make the point that existing criminal law already offers robust protections in terms of
yeah,
conversion therapy, and I think that's a really important point
yeah,
that gets forgotten. And interestingly, broader than just conversion therapy, it seems to get forgotten everywhere whether it's governments, whether it's things like the EU. People don't think about the legislation that already exists, the protections that already exist, and perhaps going back and enforcing some of the law, some of the rights that people have, whether it's conversion therapy or something else. There seems to be a theme. No, we need new legislation. The old somehow
yeah,
wasn't enough, and yet obviously a lot of the time the old just hasn't been applied for this particular situation. So yeah, certainly,
yeah,
electrocuting gay men to make them straight, I mean, that's been illegal for decades, and actually that's a
yeah,
theme when we talk about when we talk about the Race Equality Act. I think that's another point that we'll talk about, law
yeah.
that's existed for decades. So yeah, I wonder sometimes this desire to feed the legislative machine.
I mean, I think that for those, one of the things, as you know, Tom, in the Free Speech Union, we often find that we're sort of fighting a language war as much as anything else, because a lot of things that might have very severe consequences for free speech and freedom of expression are always phrased in wonderful ways. How could anybody possibly be for hate speech, or how could anybody want misinformation online, and so on and so forth. And I think we're in similar territory with the gender conversion, the conversion therapy bill, or at least the attempts to ban trans inclusive conversion therapy.
Freddie, your point about language is well made. And certainly one of the things I've learned about some of the more extreme transgender activism is that there is embedded homophobia in this. So actually,
Mm,
you are talking about things that you think are against homophobia, and they import a new kind of homophobia. And this is what really confused me when we were talking about the conversion therapy ban, is that actually some of these conversion therapies are homophobic in the way they
mm,
operate. So, this language point is really well made, that's our fight, that's our battleground, because the activists behind it are very well aware of that, very well aware
yeah,
of what people wanting to do the right thing, wanting to be seen to do the right thing, and they use that and they leverage that. Which brings us nicely onto our next point, which again is all about language, Freddie. EDI, so equality,
mm,
diversity, and inclusion, or equity, diversity, and inclusion. We have some very, very, very different versions of EDI, I would say, in the manifestos. So, where does EDI come in? For example, to the Labour manifesto, Labour will introduce a landmark Race Equality Act to enshrine the full right to equal pay for Black, Asian, and other ethnic minority people, strengthening the protection against dual discrimination and root out other racial inequalities. So they're going to bring in a new act. And the point you made in your analysis of this manifesto is that actually what they're talking about, unequal pay for the same job, has been banned by the Race Relations Act 1965. Now, that is nearly 60 years ago. But what Labour's actually referring to is the statistical markers of invisible disparities. And that is like a door, isn't it, into
mm,
critical race theory, it's into grievance policies, all of what we've been defending our members against now for 4 years, particularly following the Black Lives Matter summer of 2020, when this anti-racism stuff kind of just came in almost like a tsunami, wasn't it? It's like
yeah, yeah,
it's everywhere, and it's flooded everywhere. So this, we fear, would put EDI on steroids. Is that fair to say, Freddie?
I think so, and the connection is obviously that when a piece of legislation of this kind is passed, when there inevitably will be disparities in some organisations, and if you look at those disparities, some people might say they were to do with regional geography, familial structure, sex, or social class. But if you want to, you can probably see a lot of those disparities through a racial lens and say, okay, there's a problem here in this organisation with racial disparities and form of racial discrimination. So what do you do about that? And it's at that stage where you try and operationalise things that can show that you are operating in a way that's abiding by the law, if you like. So what do you do? What are your action points? Well, one of them inevitably, I think, will be even more equality, diversity and inclusion training initiatives, workplace initiatives, EDI officers as well, to ensure that the training and the initiatives take place, and so on and so forth. And of course, they will bring with them things like unconscious bias training and how to avoid racial microaggressions. And then in a report to justify what your organisation has done to level up the playing field in race terms, you can say, well, yes, we do have a problem, as these stats show. However, these are the actions that we're taking to try and resolve that issue. And again, Tom, it comes back to the language issue, because, why on earth could anybody possibly be against something called a Race Equality Act? Do you want racial inequality? But the problem with these initiatives from a free speech perspective, and you are the expert on this in the team, really, is that they often stifle free speech. They often stifle other alternative viewpoints that workplace free speech is an important thing. But too often, these sorts of EDI training schemes become a form of indoctrination where only one view is allowed, and this is the mantra that you must learn, and these are the basic tenets that you must memorize. So probably the most high-profile case that the Free Speech Union has had over the past 12 months was Carl Borg-Neal, the former Lloyds Bank employee who was that's online equality, diversity and inclusion training. And it was a particular section about intent, the intent behind words. And they were discussing sort of racial language. And he asked a question, which included the N-word, about, what do I do if one of my black members of staff uses the N-word? And it was a question. It was phrased as a question. And the trainer on that course was so outraged and so triggered by it, they had to take 5 days off work. And there was an investigation by the bank into his behaviour, and in the end he was sacked for asking that question. So it's a very extreme example, but you can imagine a whole spectrum from the Carl Borg-Neals of this world that ask questions like that, to on the other end of the spectrum, people who just simply stay silent because they know that any other viewpoint simply won't be tolerated. So you've got that chilling effect at the other end of the spectrum.
And it really matters, Freddie. I did the analysis just in the last week as to what proportion of our cases relate in some way to one of three things: either a speech policy, a pronoun policy, or EDI training. And when I say speech policy, I generally mean an EDI policy that's been brought in, that a member comes to us and says, I am worried about this, and I'm worried that I don't believe it because it's based on whether it's critical race theory or gender ideology. It could be either or something else. 20% fall into one of those three categories of our cases. So one in five of our cases, one of the five of the people who come to us in some way come to us for EDI purposes. And that doesn't include people who might get in trouble on Twitter, because we put the case as being a Twitter case and relating to social media. That's how we would categorize it. But some of them, again, may be people getting into trouble at work because of an underlying speech policy, an underlying EDI policy. Yeah. So you've got at least 20, probably more percent of our cases relating to that. And the work we did, the survey we did, 62% of people at work, when they go into this training, this EDI training, are self-censoring. But I mean, getting back to the manifesto, so that was, we were mentioning the Race Equality Act that's being proposed by Labour. Under the Conservative manifesto, there's a pledge to halve the amount of taxpayer money spent on external consultants. We will introduce controls on all equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives and spending. And then under reform, there is a particular focus on the police, common sense policing, not woke policing. They will scrap all diversity, equality, and inclusion roles and regulations to stop two-tier policing. And then when it comes to the Lib Dems, there doesn't seem to be direct reference to EDI, but there is reference to hate crime legislation. And there will be an intention to make misogyny a hate crime. Very slightly different way of approaching the EDI topic, but actually, this sort of inclusion of various protected characteristics, ever increasing number of protected characteristics into the Equality Act, then does lead to some sort of an EDI framework being placed around it. So that's kind of how I'm adding that to my compare and contrast across the manifestos. So there's, again, definitely some clear blue water, I think, between the parties when it comes to EDI and EDI initiatives and money being spent on it.
So I think from our perspective, there's an interesting kind of angle on EDI training in that last year we produced a report about why the police need extra free speech training, and it was based on freedom of information requests. So we asked, what training do they do on EDI versus what training do they do on freedom of speech, law around freedom of speech. And as you might imagine, it was complete. There was so much training that was going on EDI type issues, but very little on protections for free speech under the law. So, I mean, it's an interesting one for us because I think, and I wrote this in my analysis of the Reform Manifesto, it's not necessarily, although it's not necessarily about the EDI training on its own. I think it's that there isn't this counterweight that often in organisations like the police, they don't get the counterweight of free speech and freedom of expression training to sit alongside. Because there's no doubt there is equalities legislation that has to be abided by. But when you don't get that counterweight of the protections for free speech, I think that's when you have the real problem, when you're not getting that balancing. And certainly we saw in the police, there is not at all a balance of training between the two.
And we wrote a report on that. So there is a report on our website about the urgent need to educate the police on the importance of free speech. The last sort of compare and contrast, Freddie, I thought was misinformation and disinformation. And the two of the analyses you did where that pops up are the Lib Dems and Reform. So in the Lib Dem manifesto, there is a proposal to tackle fake news. And the way they're going to do that is to support the BBC, both to provide impartial news and information and to take a leading role in increasing media literacy and educating all generations in the impact of fake news. So that's the Lib Dems. On the Reform side, the closest sort of reference to misinformation and disinformation is what we've already talked about, actually, the review of the online safety bill. And that is being driven by a desire from Reform to push back against social media giants pushing baseless transgender ideology and critical race theory and treating them as facts, and anyone who disagrees with it saying that's disinformation or misinformation. So there is a clear distinction there, I think it's fair to say, between sort of the tackling fake news on the one hand, and of course, no one here is suggesting that fake news isn't a thing. It is. There are people who go around peddling absolute nonsense on the internet.
Yeah.
We know that, and we know that very well. But I wouldn't necessarily, Freddie, go to BBC Verify. I think we've had that pop up too many times on the podcast and pop up too many times in all sorts of different situations where it just hasn't done. It's not fit for purpose, I don't think, and certainly there's a lot of bias in what we hear on the mainstream media, which we talk about all the time.
Yeah, and I think it would be very, very easy to go into a critique of the BBC, but as a matter of fact, there simply isn't an organisation anywhere, left wing, right wing, whatever point on the political spectrum, that can act as a single arbiter of truth, and can somehow act in a way that, philosophers of science have been trying to work out science from non-science from centuries, and have not been able to. But so it's like, media organizations are not specially equipped to do something that simply Western civilization has not ever found a way to do. What is a much better policy is a sort of pluralistic media space.
So, Freddie, one of the things that strikes me, we've gone through the Conservative Manifesto, we've gone through the Labour Manifesto, we've gone through the Liberal Democrats Manifesto, we've gone through the Contract of Reform, and really in quite a lot of detail, pulling out what we've discussed today. The two other largest parties are the Scottish National Party and the Green Party. Now, we haven't done a deep dive there. So unfortunately, I think it's fair to say that we're leaving our listeners with some homework to do. But hopefully people can see that with the variety of things that have come out of those four manifestos, there's a lot of thinking to be done around balancing these and thinking about what this means for what people do on the 4th of July. But we should make it crystal clear that, it would make a lot of sense for people to go and have a look at the SNP and also the Green Party and any other important player in the upcoming election to have a look at the free speech elements of it. And if people do have any particular points they'd like us to draw out, and we can revisit this topic. We do have time before the election. We can revisit it and draw listeners' attention to any other major compare and contrast when it comes to free expression with other manifestos that we haven't talked about today. But is there anything you think we've missed today in this sort of? It's a one-topic episode. It's the manifestos, Freddie. But is there anything we've missed?
Well, I don't think we've not in terms of what's in the manifestos, but I do think the environment in which politics in the UK is played out, so parliamentary politics and including government, is one in which increasingly transnational networks, transnational regulatory bodies, legislation that is passed in, for instance, the European Union, like the Digital Services Act, is increasingly impinging on free speech and freedom of expression in this nation state, as it were, in this particular container of the United Kingdom. So what we're really talking about in these manifestos is things that is within the control of those potential governments, the parties that will form the governments, but parties that will form the government. But I think one of the things to look out for, for instance, I mentioned it already, the Digital Services Act, the way that is essentially clamping down on various forms of speech. There's no doubt that Ofcom want to align themselves with the Digital Services Act in the EU. Elon Musk has recently fought off a attempt by the Australian government to ban from the internet globally, something that the Australian government didn't want Australian citizens to see. We have disinformation trackers like the Global Disinformation Index and NewsGuard that create ratings of news agencies that they regard as spreading misinformation, which is often things that they find politically distasteful themselves. So all of that creates an environment which actually is impacting the UK. And it's obviously not something that's mentioned in the manifesto. It's probably not something that's even under our control. But it's increasingly these sort of transnational networks that are creating a sort of an increasingly censorial environment in the UK.
That issue of the backdrop is really important and really well made, Freddie. These are, we could go back to the days of yes minister, yes prime minister, to go back to end where we started, and we could really distinguish between, that there was real focus and autonomy, I suppose, for the UK at that time in dealing and handling these issues. That it's a different world now. It's a completely different world. There is no opting out of this supranational regulations. A lot of the time it is just the regulations because it's so much harder to get primary legislation, even through those supranational parliaments. But regulations have teeth and they're easier to get through and they're a little bit more faceless as well. So there's win-win-win for those who are trying to pull the strings behind the scenes. So Freddie, thank you for making that point. I think it's really important. And it doesn't help, though, does it, when we're coming to think about who we vote for in the next election? But it's such an important part of the mood music, without a doubt. Freddie, thank you so much for joining us for a second
Yeah.
week. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've thoroughly enjoyed speaking with our listeners. But we'll have
Been a
Ben back with
pleasure.
us
Yeah.
next week. Thank you to everyone, and we will speak to you next week. So goodbye for now.